Hi everyone. Let's go ahead and start our next chapter, which is chapter 23, covering the respiratory system. So if we look at just a general function, an overall function of the respiratory system, it's going to, of course, cover respiration. And we'll talk about how there's several different types of respiration. We're going to talk about this external respiration. We have internal respiration, and there's also cellular respiration that happens in the body. But respiration in general is a collective process by which oxygen and carbon dioxide are continuously exchanged between the atmosphere and the body cells. So we have to take a look at everything in between. What happens to it between the atmosphere and the body cells? And that's really what this chapter covers, is going through it. And of course, you might be thinking, why? Why do we need oxygen? And of course, what is the point of carbon dioxide exchanging these two gases? So, of course, you might remember from 1406 that oxygen is going to be key to cellular respiration, specifically that aerobic ATP production. And then whenever that occurs, whenever aerobic ATP production occurs, it is going to produce CO2 as a waste product, and we have to get rid of that. CO2 is going to be toxic to the body, so we've got to get rid of it. And that's why there's going to be this exchange of breathing in oxygen and getting it to the body cells for ATP production, and then picking up that CO2 that the cells just produced and getting rid of it. Now, this is going to be a conjoined effort with a lot of different systems. So we have the respiratory system that's going to come into play, of course. That's the main focus of this chapter, right? But we can't forget about all of the other systems that are going to help make this whole process work. The skeletal system is actually going to work with the muscular system. The muscular system we're going to talk about how contractions are going to occur in different muscles, and this is going to be responsible for the whole ventilation process of bringing in that oxygen and getting rid of that carbon dioxide. And of course, we know that one of the functions for the skeletal system is the attachment of those muscles. Remember, if these muscles want to contract, they have to have a signal from the nervous system. But we're also going to be talking about other ways that the nervous system is going to be involved here. But that's the main thing that's going to happen if we're putting all of this together and looking at the whole process of respiration. And of course, cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is important because that's how oxygen is going to get to the body cells. That's how carbon dioxide is going to eventually get to the lungs to exhale, is through the cardiovascular system, being transported around through the cardiovascular system and pumped by the heart. So the first thing that we're going to do, the first section that we're going to take a look at, is just introducing the respiratory system. I felt like I just did that right, introducing it. But we're going to state general functions. We looked at one big function. We'll take a look at some other functions. And then we're going to take a look at the different organs that are going to be involved here in the respiratory system. We'll also take a look at the two types of organization that we have. We're going to be taking a look at the mucous membrane. And how it's going to kind of change as we go throughout the respiratory system. And then we'll be taking a look at the mucus produced by that mucous membrane. So here's general functions. As you can see, some of this is kind of wrapped up in that whole process of respiration that we talked about. So this is going to be an airway passage. This is going to be where air moves between the atmosphere and the alveoli. It's also going to be a site for oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. So we'll talk about how oxygen is going to be, it's going to move from the alveoli into the bloodstream. And then we're going to talk about how carbon dioxide diffuses from the bloodstream to the alveoli. This is also, of course, where lots of olfactory receptors are going to be found. It's actually, I say lots, but it's going to be a tiny little, about a quarter size spot superior to, in the superior portion of the nasal cavity. That sounds pretty cool, though, a nasal academy. Sounds pretty interesting. But yeah, you have all of those, lots and lots of different olfactory receptors. I say different, but they have one function, right? Is going to be going in and detecting odor. That nasal academy kind of threw me off there. But also sound production. This is probably one of my favorite things to talk about in this chapter is sound production, and talking about how when we move air across the vocal cords, they're going to vibrate, and that's how sound is produced. So let's take a look at how this is organized. Well, first off, let's take a look at some of these organs, some of the major organs and major structures that are going to be found here in the respiratory system. So of course, this is where we have the nose, a nasal cavity, the pharynx, which is also called the throat, the larynx, which is also called the voice box, the trachea, which is also called the windpipe. Of course, remember, always use your fancy words, right? Whenever you're answering questions on the test, you'll always want to use pharynx and larynx and trachea instead of windpipe and throat. Then you're going to have the bronchus. That's singular. Remember that bronchi is going to be plural, so lots of bronchi. You're going to have bronchioles. And we'll talk about the divisions of all of these. You have different divisions of the bronchi, the bronchioles, and eventually that leads to the alveoli. And these, most of those, and these are actually going to be housed inside of the lungs. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So there's a couple of different ways we can organize these structures. We can organize these structures, organize the general organization of the respiratory system. Sometimes you can go in and structurally organize them, breaking it up into an upper and a lower respiratory tract. If we take a look and see where the dividing line is, it's right in there, right? So the upper respiratory tract is going to be composed of the nose, nasal cavity, pharynx. You might have heard this term before if you have an upper respiratory infection or lower respiratory infection. That's what it's kind of referring to. Lower respiratory tract is going to be everything from the larynx down. Now, some books will include the larynx in the upper respiratory tract, but this book doesn't. Of course, I wouldn't trick you like that on the test. Hey, where's the larynx included in? Is it the upper or lower respiratory tract? So that's going to be the upper and the lower respiratory tract there. What we're going to look at is how it's functionally organized, going in and looking at something called the conducting zone. And the conducting zone is it's going to be these structures that are mainly there to transport air. And that is going to be from the nose all the way to these tiny, tiny little terminal bronchioles. And then after that, it turns into the respiratory zone. The respiratory zone is where eventually gas exchange is going to take place in the alveoli. So you can kind of remember where it stops and starts. Look at this. The conducting zone is going to stop at the terminal bronchioles. Isn't that clever of them, stopping the conducting zone at the terminal bronchioles? And look, the respiratory zone starts with the respiratory bronchioles. So you can kind of think of it that way. So that is going to be kind of how it's all set up here. Let's take a look at the mucous membrane of the respiratory tract here. So remember, anytime that you see that word mucosa, it is going to refer to the mucous membrane. And if we just look at a general structure of the respiratory mucosa, it is going to have the epithelium, and we'll talk about the different types of epithelium we're going to have across this tract that we just looked at down here, because it does change. And it's always going to sit on top of a basement membrane, and it's always going to have this underlying lamina propria. And that is going to be mainly alveolar connective tissue. But look, this is really important, is the fact that there's lots of blood vessels in there. And you have cilia, those tiny little hair-like structures on top of the cells, through most of the tract. It's actually going to be through most portions of the conducting zone. And we'll talk about the importance of cilia later on. But let's take a look at the epithelium, specifically just the epithelium of the respiratory tract. So most of it is going to be this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So that's a mouthful, right? That is going to it's going to start, the respiratory tract starts with this type of epithelium. And as it goes down, all the way down to the alveoli, it ends with simple squamous epithelium. And you see how it gets thinner and thinner? And it's mainly because the function changes from what we're doing up here to what we're doing down here. Remember that a lot of the structures in the conducting zone are just going in and passing air through. So that's why you're going to have most of the conducting zone is going to have this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So you have your nasal cavity, the sinuses, the nasopharynx, the trachea, the inferior portion of the larynx, the bronchi, the main and the lobar bronchi. And then it's going to be kind of towards the end of the conducting zone is where it starts to become thinner to eventually getting to the alveoli that's going to have this simple squamous epithelium. And again, it's because of function changes. This is where gas exchange takes place in these little alveoli, and we need it to be very thin so gas can move across the membrane rather quickly. Now there is going to be some exceptions. So you might be wondering, hey, where is the oropharynx? Where is the laryngopharynx? You might not, because you might not know they exist right now because we haven't even talked about them. But that's going to be where we have stratified squamous epithelium. So let's go back to this picture and talk about why. So the oropharynx is roughly right, starts roughly right in here. Oh, stop that. And then it's going to go, that stratified squamous epithelium is going to go and through that superior portion of the larynx. So if you think about why it's stratified squamous epithelium, look, there's the mouth, there's the oral cavity, and this is going to be subject to any kind of food or liquids that we are going to ingest. So that's why we need that stratified squamous epithelium, is for that protective mechanism that the stratified squamous epithelium is going to give us. Yeah, the pseudostratified gives us some layers of protection, but this is actually a lot better at protecting against abrasion. So that's why we're going to have it in those places where they are going to be exposed to any ingested materials. But if we take a look at this and why we have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium through most of the respiratory tract, it's mainly because here we do have a nice little layer of protection, but there is goblet cells that are going to be found in here, and we'll talk about how these goblet cells are going to produce this nice layer of mucus that's sitting on top of the epithelium. Not too thick, not too thin, it's just right. And then you're going to have the cilia as well. So we'll talk about the importance of the cilia and talk about the importance of the mucus here in a minute. But look, this is really interesting. This is pretty rare in the body, this simple ciliated columnar, simple ciliated cuboidal. You don't find cilia a whole lot on these simple structures. Now we'll talk about simple columnar and the digestive system, but it's not ciliated. There is another part in the reproductive systems where it is ciliated, these simple epithelium ciliated, but you don't find it a whole lot. So that's kind of exciting, right? So let's talk about the main importance of mucus and its secretions. So it's produced mainly from the goblet cells, but you do have some mucus glands, some serous glands that can secrete it as well, but it's mainly goblet cells. What they do is they secrete this thing called mucin. Mucin is a protein, and it will combine with water, and when it combines with water, it produces mucus. So as you can kind of imagine, mucus is going to be kind of this watery substance, but it's not too watery because the mucin protein actually is going to increase the viscosity of the mucus. So it's not like water. And what that does, what good that is it's going to serve as this substance that's going to help trap anything that we breathe in, like dust, pollen, dirt, anything like that. So really, depending on how often, or not how often, if we're exposed to irritants, it's going to kind of give us an idea as how much we produce a day. It says we produce generally 1 to 7 tablespoons daily. That's a lot of mucus. But if you think about how there's a lot of structures in our body that's going to, produce mucus. I mean, I guess it's not that much. It's enough to help perform the tasks that it needs to, which is what we'll look at later. So if you think about times when you might produce a little bit more mucus, it's when you maybe have caught a cold or some other virus that causes it. So that's an irritant. What it's doing is or even allergies, right? What it's doing is it's going in and trying to flush whatever it is that's irritating it out. So if it's an allergy that has irritated the mucous membrane, if it's a cold virus or a flu virus or anything like that that has irritated the mucous membrane, it's going to secrete more mucus so it can try and flush it out whichever way is possible. It's going in and trapping whatever it can to get it out of there. Also, cold weather is going to cause you to produce a little bit more mucus as well, but it causes it to be a little bit more watery. So anytime that you're exposed to cold, you have a little bit more water condensation that occurs, and it kind of freezes the cilia as well. So instead of, instead of the cilia moving it, to the back of your throat, I'm not using my fancy words right, to the back of your pharynx, it is going to kind of run out of your nose because of how much you are going to produce. Also, when you're crying, you can produce a little bit more, but a lot of times it's going to be not only you're producing a little bit more mucus, but you're producing tears as well. That's kind of flowing down through the ducts. But this is great because it's got lots of different substances that we talked about in the last chapter. Remember, we talked about these nice innate defenses that we had for that first line of defense. And look, here's an adaptive defense mechanism that we have. This IgA. Remember, IgA is found in all of those external secretions. So it's found in semen, it's found in tears, it's found in saliva, it's found in mucus here. Lysozyme and defensins are antimicrobial, antibacterial proteins that are going to help fight off microbes as well. So it is really good that the mucus is going to trap all of this kind of stuff in so it can help defend against any microbes. So it's called sputum when it's coughed up with saliva and trapped substances. So we're going to do this is a big chapter. It's very big. We are going to cover the different organs first. So we're going to start with the upper respiratory tract. We're going to be taking a look at the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinuses, and the pharynx, and then we'll move down to the lower respiratory tract. And once we have all of that covered, we're going to talk about the mechanics behind respiration. We're going to talk about how we breathe in and out, how gas is exchanged, and how these gases are transported around in the body. And we'll talk about all the factors that are going to go along with it. So until next time.